debate. We have hundreds of people watching live right now on Zoom, many more on YouTube, and others who will see it on demand over the coming days. My name is Jordan Bateman. I'm a proud CPC member, like so many of you watching tonight. And I hope this debate will help all of us as we work through our ballots and determine who should lead our party into the next election and defeat Justin Trudeau. Tonight, we're joined by 3 of the 4 leadership candidates, Dr. Leslyn Lewis, Mr. Aaron O'Toole, and Mr. Derek Sloan. We appreciate their time and their willingness to talk with our BC members. The 4th candidate, Mr. Peter MacKay, was invited by our CPC EDAs repeatedly, but he declined our invitation to speak with our BC members. The inspiration for this event is the experience that many of us had while canvassing voters during the 2019 election. In too many instances, our party's policy positions were deemed either inadequate or irrelevant to the primary concerns expressed by British Columbians on doorsteps. Tonight, our 3 candidates will each address 8 questions put together by the BC Electoral District Associations. The 8 topics will range from the carbon tax to cancel culture, from affordable housing to forestry, and many others in between. I would like to point out that these are not my questions, but the questions developed by the volunteers and members and door knockers and the grassroots of our party across British Columbia. The format will be simple. Each candidate will have 45 seconds to answer the question, followed by a one-on-one debate. I'll pair them off so that everyone gets a chance to talk to each other about the issue for 2 minutes. In the second part of the debate, each candidate will get to ask one another a question, followed by a one-on-one debate. A brief closing statement from the candidates will wrap us up tonight. A few notes, like many of you watching, I am undecided on how to mark my ballot, and I'm hopeful tonight will help me decide as I weigh their responses on BC issues. Remember, ballots are arriving at our homes this month and must be received back in Ottawa by August 21st, so time is of the essence. I will also flash a yellow card when candidates have 10 seconds left, and a red card when they're down to 5 seconds, and politely interrupt them when time limits are reached. I'll do my best to ensure that each candidate has a fair amount of time in the one-on-one debates to make their voice heard, and that our BC questions are answered. Fortunately, I know that these 3 have a lot of respect for one another, and as Conservatives, we agree on far more than we disagree. I ask for their courtesy to one another, demonstrating that fairness and politeness that we Canadians are world renowned for. Finally, in a perfect world, we would have done this debate in person. COVID-19 has thrown our entire leadership campaign into the Zoom world. This is new for all of us. And while we have taken every measure possible to ensure strong, reliable internet feeds, crazy things can happen. Please bear with us and rest assured we're going to push through any technical glitches. For those of you who'd like to weigh in as we go along, click the chat button below to open the chat box on the right side of your browser. Please be respectful and kind in that chat, or our moderators will step in. On Zoom, there will also be 3 polls that will pop up at various points, so be sure to vote early and often in those. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. You know them from TV, you know them from holding Trudeau to account, you know them from their tweets and Facebook posts and from their many, many campaign emails, Dr. Leslyn Lewis, Mr. Aaron O'Toole, and Mr. Derek Sloan. Our first question tonight was crafted by the amazing people in Nanaimo Ladysmith. It will be answered first by Dr. Lewis, followed by Mr. Sloan, and finally Mr. O'Toole. Each has 45 seconds to respond. Dr. Lewis. During the 2019 federal election, our volunteers repeatedly heard on the doorsteps of constituents about the need for a real climate plan for Canada. If a Conservative government terminates the federal carbon tax, the BC provincial carbon tax will remain in place. What is your specific plan? How does it compare or differ to other parties in BC? And how does it differ from our 2019 campaign plan?
Thank you for your question. Good evening, everyone. I certainly wish that I could be there in person to be within your beautiful province with you, but I'm still happy that we could connect by technology tonight, and I just want to thank the organizers. So with respect to your question, a Lewis government would eliminate the federal carbon tax. In order to win the next election, we need to be able to credibly challenge Justin Trudeau on the environment. I hold a Master's of Environmental Studies from York University, and I've spent years studying how to protect Canada's lakes, forests, rivers, and to protect it from needless damage, building our economy. And I have a plan for a greener Canada, and that plan actually creates jobs and positively impacts on our environment in real measurable ways. My plan is to promote responsible natural resource development by including our resources, liquefied natural
Thank you,
gas,
Dr. Lewis.
and global emissions.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I'm going to give everyone a minute on this first one because I know you do want to say hello to our viewers tonight, and so we'll go a little bit further there. Mr. Sloan, the climate plan, a climate plan for Canada, for British Columbia.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'm glad to be here. I made the point in the last election that we have to do more than simply have an environmental plan. We have to be proud of it. And I think one of the things we didn't do is differentiate the ideological underpinning of our plan. And conservatives are not climate alarmists. They're conservationists at heart. We need to have a strong conservation-oriented plan that deals with reducing real waste in the environment. If you're on a diet, you can count calories like the Liberals do with their carbon tax, or you can focus on eating better. That's what conservation is about. We need to have a great conservation plan that deals with cleaning up the water, cleaning up the air, and everything else will take care of itself. If we have some good things in there that actually impact the environment, people will understand we're credible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. Mr. O'Toole, carbon taxes, climate plans.
Well, first, Jordan, thank you. Thank to all the BC EDAs. And thank you to Nanaimo Ladysmith for this question. In BC, I helped in 11 ridings before the last election. And throughout Southern Ontario, my region, I heard repeatedly that the Liberals and the left had branded us as not caring about the environment. So we have to have a real plan. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill the Trudeau carbon tax. I'm going to get pipelines built, and we will win the next election. My plan is very detailed, and it is about respecting the provinces. Ottawa should not dictate. We should actually leverage technology, whether it's carbon capture and storage, nuclear power, other forms where we can partner with the provinces who are reducing their emissions in a way they see fit. If we're not serious about this issue in the next campaign, we will not win. I have a serious plan.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. All right, we're going to pair off Dr. Lewis and Mr. O'Toole for the first round of debating this question. You have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Well, certainly, I know that Dr. Lewis worked a lot with the feed-in tariff and the program brought into Ontario by Jerry Butts and the Kathleen Wynne Dalton McGuinty government. Can you talk a little bit about whether you feel—
That's actually incorrect, Mr. O'Toole. I did not work a lot with the feed-in tariffs in Canada. I worked in the developing nations, in African countries, selling Canadian technology developed by Canadian entrepreneurs to African nations. So I just wanted to correct you on that statement, Mr. O'Toole.
But the feed-in tariff in Ontario, were you not involved in that as well?
Absolutely not. Never. I was never involved in the feed-in tariff in Ontario. My work dealt with Africa only.
Well, because that program in Ontario was disastrous and drove up electricity, hydro rates. And so what we have to do as a party is show that we have a plan to get resources to market and to partner with provinces on their programs to get emissions down. If the Alberta wants to work with large emitters, we should respect that. If BC has their own approach, we should cut off Trudeau's carbon tax and respect that. That's what I've been trying to run in this platform.
And we should also respect the fact that your plan has actually put in place a double carbon tax in places like it would affect BC because they have a provincial carbon tax, and your plan actually puts in place a double carbon tax.
That's incorrect. In fact, eliminating the federal carbon tax, right now the BC carbon tax is about $30 a ton, and Trudeau was wanting to go up to 50. I would eliminate that. So the federal portion would be taken off. What the provinces decide to do, Ottawa needs to get out of the way. And it's been disappointing that Mr. McKay and some people are misrepresenting my plan when it's important for us to have a serious approach on this issue and be straight with people.
Thank you both. That was excellent. Dr. Lewis and Mr. Sloan, 2 minutes for you to discuss.
So, Dr. Lewis, I have a question, and I've asked this question a few times before. So I'm the only candidate that says we need to get out of the Paris Agreement. And I know that you've said that it's not a binding agreement, so it doesn't matter if we're in it. But you've also said that on the United Nations Mass Migration Compact, we should get out of it because it impacts national sovereignty. So I wonder how you can have two different opinions on those issues. And I really feel that the Paris Agreement is very critical to making sure we develop energy in Canada. And I don't think it's good for us to be in.
Well, Mr. Sloan, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that question. I believe that the perils that we have based on our natural resources, the lack of development, have been self-inflicted by provisions such as Bill C-48 and Bill C-69. We can set our own national policies. The Paris targets are self-imposed targets, and they have been set by Stephen Harper, and also they have been supported by Trudeau, so two governments. They're very low targets. They're extremely easy to meet. I believe that it's sensationalist to say we have to pull out in order to protect the environment. That is not true. That is a false statement. We can set our own environmental policies. The United Nations does not dictate the sovereignty of how we operate. We can set our own policies. We can dictate our own sovereignty. And if we have poor national bills and legislation, that is self-inflicted. We can repeal Bill C-48, repeal Bill C-69, and implement enabling legislation that will develop our natural resources.
Well, you know, with all due respect, nobody thinks that we can meet. I mean, you said the reduction targets that we have are no big deal. They're a huge deal because we're saying 30% reduction. Nobody thinks we can meet those. So I don't know why you think we can, even with mass.
Mr. Sloan,
we're at 2 minutes, so I'm going to cut you off there.
They are set by ourselves. So
we're at 2 minutes, Dr. Lewis, so I'm going to move on here. Mr. Sloan and Mr. O'Toole, you have the final 2 minutes on this question on carbon taxes, climate plans, reaching out to Canadians.
Yeah, so Aaron, I just had a question for you. I'm not sure what exactly it means, but it is a little concerning to me. I notice on your climate change platform, you talk about a national industrial regulatory and pricing regime across the country. You do say that you want industries to pay rather than taxing ordinary Canadians. I'm afraid that industry is going to pass those costs on to ordinary Canadians. So maybe you can fill me in on what that means.
Well, what Jason Kenney and Doug Ford are doing, Derek, is working with some of the larger emitters to get their emissions down without disrupting production. And what I think we can do federally is there may be ways we can actually accelerate that through capital cost allowance, depreciation. And I've been saying this for many years, if over a 5, 10, 15-year period, emitters get their emissions down, perhaps we can reduce their taxes, recognizing the public good of the work they're doing without shifting emissions, without shifting production. It's about working smart. As all provinces know, it's the provinces opening up the economies, making the decisions. So the economy is a shared area of jurisdiction. Ottawa should not dictate to the provinces their programs with respect to the environment. We should only try and partner where we can.
So it's not a carbon pricing mechanism then? It sounds kind of like a carbon pricing mechanism. Am I mistaken?
No, it is not. It's working with the provinces that are establishing their regimes. It's about respect for the fact that Alberta knows its own needs. Ontario knows its own needs better than an Ottawa bureaucrat does. In fact, the carbon tax court case in Alberta said that it was unconstitutional what Justin Trudeau did. So out of the group here, including Mr. McKay, I've been the most consistent critic of the Trudeau carbon tax for many years. It's just disturbing that Mr. McKay and then doesn't show up for events.
Aaron, I'm just going to quickly say the Paris Accord, nobody thinks we can meet 30%.
All right, we're at 2 minutes. Thank you for that. We're going to move down to coastal resource management. This question comes from our riding in North Island, Powell River, beautiful part of British Columbia, well worth a visit when we get through this pandemic. For BC to maximize both its commercial fish harvesting and energy sectors, our natural resource industry needs Ottawa to provide improved ocean access. According to the Pacific Halibut Management Association of BC, the Trudeau government threatens to take 40% of the North Coast area away from commercial fishing, with an estimated economic loss of more than $100 million annually, devastating the coastal economy, even though 35% of BC coastline is already protected by the end of 2020. On the energy front, addressing the stigma of tanker traffic, reducing the chance of oil spills, and ensuring quick response if they occur are all critical. How will your national ocean strategy address these and other coastal resource exploitation issues? Mr. Sloan, you will go first, followed by Mr. O'Toole and Dr. Lewis. Mr. Sloan, coastal outcomes.
Well, we need to repeal Bill C-48 and expand tanker traffic. Managing our fisheries and growing our stocks rather than banning fishing, and to work with BC fishermen. As far as oil spills go, we have the Western Canada Marine Response Corps. These are frontline responders best suited to respond to coastal spills. Of course, there aren't many coastal spills, but we have to be able to respond to them quickly. We need more funding for groups like that. And I will be defunding radical eco groups like the Tides Foundation and other groups like that. And we can put it in to actually combating things like oil spills and being better prepared for them. So I would also have the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries work with the Pacific States, British Columbia Oil Spill Task Force.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. You're 50 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. O'Toole, coastal strategy.
Absolutely. It's critical for us to balance off development, whether it's energy, the fishery resource, and the beautiful coastline of BC's Pacific, our Pacific Gateway. Nothing shows that we were out of step on that back in before the 2015 election, more than the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station. We need, as we get pipelines to market, and I've got the most ambitious plan to get our resources to market, we need to be world leaders on spill control and spill response, both in the Vancouver area and the Prince George area. I'm going to make specific investments as we determine pipelines are in the national interest. We have to invest. Fisheries will be a science-based approach, but with industry at the table because of the jobs that are dependent on it.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Dr. Lewis.
Thank you. So I think it's very important that we balance environmental sustainability with our economic development, and that includes protecting our coastal waterways. And I think we have to also remember that the oil and gas sector is the most responsible and environmentally friendly on this earth, the Canadian oil and gas sector. And that's a message that the Canadian government should be broadcasting around the world. With respect to the tanker bans, that ban is actually unfair because it does not protect our coastal waterways against American oil tankers, only Canadian. And for that reason, I would repeal Bill C-48 and Bill C-69 and reopen the door to getting our resources to the market in an environmentally sustainable way. And there are appropriate times when we could create marine protected
Thank you, Dr.
areas.
Lewis.
Thank
you, Dr. Lewis. Mr. Sloan and Dr. Lewis, I'm going to pair you off now for 2 minutes to discuss a national ocean strategy.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Listen, I think that what Dr. Lewis said about repealing Bill C-48 is very important. We obviously have to expand on our resource development, both within Canada and on our coastal regions. I don't think that turning large parts of our coast into no-go zones when it comes to fishing is in the best interest of Canada, and I'm certainly against that.
And I agree that, it is very important for us to uphold our national sovereignty even in issues such as this. And we have to remember that in protecting our coastal waterways and coastal lines, we do not have to capitulate to organizations like the United Nations who set aspirational goals that do not meet our national objective. It's very important that in appropriate times that we create and protect our marine protected areas, but that we do so by putting Canada First principles in place and not shut down our economy and not capitulate to UN bureaucrats to make them happy.
And I'll just say another thing as well. The Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation is a monopoly, and as conservatives, we need to allow fishers to benefit from free market principles. So I support the resolution that we passed in 2018 that said that the Freshwater Fish Marketing Act should be repealed and replaced with a voluntary dual market, and that fishermen under this monopoly should be given the freedom to make their own individual marketing decisions.
Okay, excellent. Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Sloan, now you'll have 2 minutes to discuss this issue.
Well, thank you. As I said earlier, when we have an ambitious resource program, I have a 100-day plan to eliminate Bill C-69, eliminate the tanker ban, and introduce a National Strategic Pipelines Act, putting a cabinet decision for pipelines to tidewater or refinement capacity. While we do that, we have to show that we're going to be world leaders in spill response. I know, Derek, you weren't there in 2015. The Kitsilano Coast Guard station that closure became a rallying cry for the left. Even though it was not a spill response station, we have to show we can be world leaders as we get our resources to those important tidewater ports.
Now, I'm just going to sort of take us back to where we left off. And I just wanted to ask you, to me, the Paris Accord has goals that are impossible to attain. And many people think that even with Justin Trudeau's excessive taxes, we're still not going to be able to meet our 30% reduction. So I just wanted to ask how you can square support for the Paris Accord with support for our pipelines and oil and resource development.
By partnering with the provinces, Derek, these are non-binding targets. So if we don't meet them, we don't meet them. We do not disrupt our production and our economy. What we have to do is come up with ways to keep developing our resources and, where we can, reduce emissions. There's big ways to do it by using clean sources for electricity generation. I know you know my work for the nuclear industry in Canada. It's near both of our ridings. That's one way. But wherever industry can actually lower the emissions without reducing production, why would that be a bad thing? It's all about making sure we don't disrupt our economy for a international meeting of the elite in Paris.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And you know, my issue, though, of course, is that the aspirational target of the Paris Agreement is to be carbon neutral by the second half of this century.
That is 2 minutes. We're going to go back to Mr. O'Toole and Dr. Lewis. I just want to say coastal issues are vitally important here in British Columbia. Where I'm sitting, I can actually look out and see Vancouver Harbor now. I've been on the oil response teams there when they've been practicing. The National Oceans Strategy is near and dear, not just to Northern British Columbia, but to lower mainland ridings as well. So maybe I'm just going to offer that caveat as I hopefully refocus Mr. O'Toole and Dr. Lewis on this issue. 2 minutes starting now.
I agree. And as you would know, Jordan, the Kitsilano issue became something that was a distraction because that center was actually not for spill control, but it became a rallying point. This is why I think we have to become world leaders in it. It's also why the tanker ban, Bill C-48, made no sense, because if sea life was a consideration, Northern Gateway should be the preferred pipeline because it didn't have as many of the concerns as there was elsewhere. So we have to have a balance where we have responsible resource development. We listen to science when it comes to the fishery, but make sure industry is at the table too.
I agree. I think it's very important that we balance economic development with economic prosperity with sustainable development, and protecting our coastal waterways is a very important initiative. I think that we have to work with not only Canadian industries, but also US industries to make sure that we have responses that could deal with potential oil spills, and make sure that we have policies in place that will make sure that our waterways are the best protected in the world.
One thing I was proud of, Jordan, was part of the Harper government, our Pacific Gateway strategy, enhancing the port and the access to it in terms of the highway as the port facilities were being expanded, the rail, all of that was to make sure that we were benefiting from that Pacific Gateway presence. And I think that is an investment we need to remind voters in the Lower Mainland that not only did we support, pipeline resource development, our shipping and cargo traffic to trade deals that we were advancing with Asia and around the world, Vancouver became a centerpiece for that. And I think that will help us claw back some support in the Lower Mainland.
And I think it's also very important that we make sure that our legislation is balanced, and that we do not have legislation that penalizes Canadian businesses while American businesses are not penalized, such as our tanker ban, which...
Sorry, Dr. Lewis. Sorry, I'm very polite in normal life. I would never interrupt you if we were over doing this over a Canadian pop. Let me tell you, but I do want to be sure that I'm being fair to everyone. The next question comes from South Okanagan, West Kootenay, and it's the shortest question. So bless them. With recent mill closures and thousands of jobs lost, how do you plan to support and promote the BC forest industry? We're going to go to Mr. O'Toole first, followed by Dr. Lewis and then Mr. Sloan. Mr. O'Toole, helping the BC forest industry.
This is critical. In fact, when I launched my campaign in January in Alberta, the video we launched spoke directly about the mill closures. When I was in the Okanagan, in the Kootenays, I heard about concerns across the province of 7, 8 mill closures in the last few years. The biggest thing we can do is I will deliver a softwood lumber agreement with the United States. I worked on trade issues in the Harper government and in the private sector, and it was my efforts that helped get the steel and aluminum tariffs removed by Canada by building bridges within the US Congress, particularly with Republican members of Congress who were senators and military veterans. So that will be my focus, supporting that industry, getting a deal.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Dr. Lewis.
Thank you. I think that we have learned a lot of lessons from COVID, and one of those lessons is to bring our manufacturing capacity back home and to create enabling capacity locally. And I think that it's a very, very important to invest in self-sufficiency, and that means producing personal protective equipment here, which will really tap into our forestry industry and will allow that industry to provide raw materials in order for us to make sure that we are better equipped for a future crisis like COVID. And I want to make sure that Canada is ready for any future pandemics and national emergencies, and the forestry industry plays a big role in that.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Mr. Sloan, forestry in British Columbia.
Yes, obviously renegotiating a long-term softwood agreement with the US is very important. And of course, Justin Trudeau could have signed a deal that would have been better, but he decided to throw the dice and wait for his friend Hillary Clinton, which never happened. And so I believe in, of course, planning a Made in Canada program, which will support our manufacturing and use of Canadian wood products. We have to remember that manufactured wood products such as, OSB, LVL, these type of products are very important. We need to protect our intellectual property. China has stolen technology from us when it comes to these manufactured wood products, and we need to make more in Canada. The wood pulp for N95 masks comes predominantly from BC. We need to make that stuff here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Sloan, we're going to pair you off first to discuss forestry in British Columbia. Gentlemen.
Absolutely. Going on what Derek was saying about the N95 masks, in fact, I was helping put together some manufacturers in Ontario with fiber suppliers in BC as we were all scrambling towards responding to the need to create critical PPE here at home. And as we've learned, after the pine beetle infestation and getting rid of that in BC, we had an oversupply for a time of fiber. Now that supply of fiber is a little uncertain. So what we have to do as part of the softwood lumber agreement we negotiate is work with industry to make sure that they have that supply so that mills are kept up to date, and that we promote our resource, like we do energy and minerals, as the most ethical, the most environmentally and indigenously sound produced resources in the world. We should hold up Canadian resources as the world standard. That is what I will champion as Prime Minister.
Yeah, that's very important. And the wood industry is such an exciting industry. It's very environmentally friendly. Wood is a superior product to many other building ingredients and is certainly more environmentally friendly. And I really support the investment in, for example, manufactured wood products, which have so many applications. We need to not only invest in our own industries, but defend our industries from incursions by other countries like China who try and steal our technology. And I will have a anti-infiltration division which deals with theft of intellectual property and espionage on Canadian soil with police and military and intelligence. And we need to make sure that we're putting Canada first and standing up to China.
Right. And as we work on building new markets to build away from reliance on China and bad actors, we've got to remember that our resources are in demand. I remember going to South Korea to finalize our free trade agreement with that country, who we helped save in the war. Wood products were also a very hot commodity in that part of the world. There's new markets for our forestry sector.
Okay, Mr. O'Toole, you can continue the story next. So if you want, you and Dr. Lewis will continue this conversation about British Columbia forest industry.
Yes, so I think it's very important that we put in place a plan for essential products, especially personal protective equipment, and that it be made in Canada, and that it tap into the BC forestry industry. And I think that we could have a positive impact on the forestry industry. I would like to work with this industry in creating new opportunities and creating new models for self-sufficiency. And that means cutting red tape for businesses and making sure that governments have incentive programs that will incentivize these businesses to develop these new areas.
Yes, and I think we've also got an amazing team in BC on this specific issue. I've been dealing with several years with Kathy McLeod, Tracy Gray, who won in Okanagan Lake Country in the last election. We need to make sure that we continue that strong voice from BC and make sure that part of the overall fight against Trudeau is his attack on working Canadians, people that work hard in the mills of British Columbia, in the auto plants of Ontario, in the energy sector in Alberta. Those people are providing for their families. They're building up Canadian economy, Canadian innovation, and the best resources in the world. We need to celebrate that, and both the Liberals and the NDP are actually undermining working people. I think our party will open its doors to make sure anyone who wants to provide for their family, we're going to fight for their opportunity to have a job and produce things in Canada.
And one way to celebrate that is by having incentives such as a 2-year amortization on 100% capital cost allowance write-offs for purchases of environmentally efficient technology that assists the forestry section. And that is one of my plans.
Excellent. Thank you both for that. Finally, on forestry, Dr. Lewis and Mr. Sloan.
Well, I think it's important that we maintain investment in Canada, and of course, intellectual property protection should be at the forefront of that discussion. You know, Aaron O'Toole brought up the fact that there's markets around the world that are expanding and they need our wood products. Of course, the United States, even though they like to fight us over the softwood issue, they don't have enough production in their own country to meet the demand. So they can only produce about 70% of their overall needs. So we are a key player for them. And I believe that we can have a good relationship with the United States. I personally believe we're going to see a Republican government again in this upcoming election in the fall. And I believe a conservative government will be well poised to deal and trade with the Republican United States.
And I think it's very important that coming out of COVID that we recognize that many of the businesses are having financial problems and that we provide these incentives, we provide financial incentives that will allow them to kickstart and to restart in developing new industries and providing new equipment that will help us to better be prepared for any future pandemics, such as providing necessary protective equipment, such as gloves and such as masks and other equipment that we will need in order to be self-sufficient.
All right, we're going to move on to Indigenous affairs. Justin Trudeau has campaigned on being a leader for Indigenous people. Yet at any given time, the tap water is not safe to drink in numerous First Nation communities across Canada. This is the case even though the federal budget for Indigenous Services Canada is now over $9 billion a year. How will you restructure Indigenous affairs and ensure better outcomes? This question will go first to Dr. Lewis, followed by Mr. Sloan and Mr. O'Toole. Dr. Lewis, Indigenous affairs.
Well, I think it's a national disgrace that we send money overseas for various projects, including clean drinking water projects, while some First Nations communities across Canada do not have the same clean drinking water. And I would like to take real action to ensure that there's clean drinking water on every First Nation reserves. And this starts by reassessing where some of the money is being sent overseas to various countries and redirecting that investment in better infrastructure on reserves and in northern communities.
Thank you. Mr. Sloan.
You know, the clean water and reserves has to be everyone's #1 priority. And I agree that we need to make sure that we're funding people in our own country and putting our own country first. So I also think, though, that we need to revive Stephen Harper's Transparency Act, which makes it possible to determine exactly where funding is going and what it's being used for. I would call for an examination from multiple groups of the effectiveness of all programs on reserves and would make a clear path for resource development that will benefit the Indigenous population. I also would like to create a sunshine list of sorts that highlights band officials making over 100K per year. I think we need to know where the money is going, and the people on the reserves deserve to know that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you. In my plan, I have a detailed outline of how we have to make the safe drinking water issue a right for Indigenous Canadians on reserve, and to do that in a deliverable way, engaging the private sector and innovation, not waiting for bureaucrats to solve it. For me, reconciliation means collaboration and participation in the economy. That's why the Northern Gateway pipeline was so impressive. 1/3 of it was equity owned by Indigenous Canadians. I've spoken to Chief Dale Swampy, who was not consulted when Trudeau canceled that pipeline arbitrarily. We see left-wing activists using the Coastal Gas Pipeline as just an anti-energy initiative. And who do they hurt? They hurt Indigenous Canadians.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Lewis and Mr. O'Toole, I'm going to pair you off first. Before I do, though, just a little bit of context. We do have close to 200 First Nations here in British Columbia, and they run the gamut from anti-development to pro-development. But we have seen a generation of young chiefs and councillors come in British Columbia willing to enter into economic agreements and spread prosperity to their communities. Ellis Ross being one of them, and then Heisla. And Ellis would love the fact that I just called him young. Anyways, Dr. Lewis, Mr. O'Toole, more on Indigenous affairs, especially in British Columbia.
Sure. Ellis Ross gave a spectacular defense against the left's illegal rail blockades on television, where he showed that Indigenous issues are being captured by activists. In the case of that first protest, a woman from California wanting to stop things in Canada. So we have to stand up, have to have an approach to stop illegal blockades. I put out a very detailed policy on that. And resource revenue sharing with Indigenous communities is key to reconciliation, allowing mutual benefit, mutual respect, and partnerships to be built. We've seen it, as you've said, in some parts of BC, in the Prince George and Okanagan area. We need to make this the norm. Partnership is reconciliation.
I also think it's very important, going back to the water issue, to make sure that we redirect funds from government bureaucracies and cut waste and redirect those funds into proper infrastructural programs that will get to the people that need it, and that will reduce on-reserve poverty. I also think it's very important that we find permanent infrastructural solutions to the clean water issue, and that should be our goal. And in the interim, I think it's important that we find immediate solutions that we can immediately put in place that will be quick and that will ensure clean access to clean drinking water while we are working out the permanent solutions.
The poverty issue is one I think we all want to tackle. And that's why my proposal on resource revenue sharing agreements being a fundamental part of engagement on resource projects is key. If you look, the Northern Gateway pipeline I referred to earlier was participation, not just in the benefit, but in the jobs. We need to provide opportunity. And I think the resource industry is an amazing opportunity for our Indigenous communities.
Thank you both. Dr. Lewis and Mr. Sloan, 2 minutes on Indigenous affairs.
There's other things that I would do as well for Indigenous communities. I support a property regime that's designed to encourage lending for private housing and small business. When it comes to illegal blockades and protests, I will make sure the authority of elected chiefs of First Nations is respected and that our resource projects cannot be undermined. I am also committed to withdrawing Canada from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This is because that treaty allows the activists to prevent projects, and it muddies the water when it comes to approvals. So we need to make sure that the way to development is clear, and we give the Indigenous a chance to say yes to projects as well.
And I think it's very important that we work with First Nations communities to strengthen economic empowerment programs so that we are more engaged in resource sharing initiatives and we are engaging in public-private partner government initiatives in developing the resources and boosting the economy in the areas of energy, mining, and transportation. I think it's also important that we explore the enabling capacity on reserves, and we looked for ways to modernize on reserves living so that they can have the technical assistance that they need to generate jobs on reserves.
Yeah, I think that economic self-sufficiency has to be our first goal, and we can't have that if our resource projects are continually shut down, and that's because of this out of control protest movement. It's because of legislating things like United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into law. I will create a commission into looking into some of these radical eco groups that are getting financed from out of country, and their purpose is to shut down our resource projects. We need to figure out where that money is coming from and put an end to it.
Thank you,
and I think
Mr.
beyond clean water, beyond clean water, are we finished? Are we?
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're finished. We're at
Okay.
we're at 2 minutes. Finally, Mr. Sloan and Mr. O'Toole for the final 2 minutes on the Indigenous issue.
As I was saying, I think this is an area where a lot of us agree on resource revenue sharing of some sort, and that has to be the way we build opportunity for all Canadians, including Indigenous Canadians. I agree with Mr. Sloan. The UN doesn't need to tell Canada what to do. We will handle our own affairs. Thank you very much. And UNDRIP is unnecessary and actually divisive because it makes some people feel that there would be a veto. And once again, the UN is gamed by the bad players who will never follow the rules anyways, like China. And people that are following it are not even putting their country first. So we have a duty to consult Indigenous Canadians in the Supreme Court. That predated UNDRIP. We don't need that agreement to tell us how we need to engage on projects with Indigenous Canadians.
Yes, Mr. O'Toole there, Aaron O'Toole is very right. And we have to be more skeptical about the UN and these things that we're signing on to. We've had long-standing constitutional protections for Indigenous in Canada. UNDRIP is an agreement that really is designed for a country that maybe has no protections at all. And we have these already worked out in our court system. They're important, but we need to make sure we have a path to resource development and a path to prosperity for our Indigenous communities.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court in Canada has said that the duty to consult does not extend to a veto. So our own sovereignty, our own judicial system recognizes the extent of the duty and when it ends. And in fact, Trudeau, despite all his symbolism and posturing, he has twice violated the duty to consult when he didn't consult the bands that owned part of the Northern Gateway pipeline. When he signed the Arctic ban in the north, he didn't consult any Indigenous people there as well. So we need to feed him a bit of his own medicine.
Thank you both. We're going to move on to question 5, and it's regarding affordable housing. It comes from Richmond Center. Previous generations were able to buy a home and raise a family on a truck driver's or a warehouse worker's wages. But today, the average working person can no longer realistically expect to buy a home. Interest rates and mortgage rules are set at a federal level, and CMHC is a crown corporation. But housing markets experience bubbles locally, where supply is not kept up with demand in both rental and purchase markets. Pardon me, Victoria, Metro Vancouver, Abbotsford Mission being extreme examples. What would you do to help increase affordability, supply, and vacancy without adding to pressure on prices? Mr. Sloan, we're going to start with you, followed by Mr. O'Toole and Dr. Lewis. Mr. Sloan, affordable housing.
This is near and dear to my heart, and I've been thinking about this very carefully. It's very simple, actually. We need to reduce our immigration levels. Our immigration levels are higher than on average for developed nations. And if you take a look at the number of immigrants that are settling in our major cities, it far outstrips the supply that we have. So that's part of it. We also need to have a moratorium on foreign residential real estate purchases. There's too many people who are buying up 10 condos, 15 condos. They don't even live there. They don't live here. We also need to deal with money laundering, which is inflating the market. So these are the things we need to do. My grandparents were able to buy a home in the 50s for $9,000. They paid it off in 3 years. They were just photographers. They worked hard, but that was the standard of living in those days. We need to get back to that again.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. Mr. O'Toole.
This is a great question, and not surprising, asked from a Lower Mainland Riding Association. First of all, the CMHC stress test was unfair, particularly to areas of the country like the Lower Mainland of BC and the Greater Toronto area where I'm an MP. Applying a one-size-fits-all to the country where there's unique needs is unfair. We also need increased supply, and I've got a plan to change some of the federal tax rules with respect to rental properties to encourage more supply. Transit also leads to more supply by more access for people to get in. So some strategic federal infrastructure investments there. And we have to take on the money laundering and the foreign abuse into our housing market. We've seen that in BC. We need to end it.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Dr. Lewis, affordable housing.
So life is becoming less affordable for many people, especially young people who are concerned that they will never be able to own a home. I want to make sure that the potential to buy a home is there for as many people as possible. And so my policies will focus on allowing even parents to be able to pull out some of their RSPs to help their children and extend that program. I would also like to increase the maximum amount of the HST rebate for new homes to potentially $35,000, which will give first-time home buyers more money in their pocket. In addition, income splitting is something that will also allow for more savings on taxes. And I would also like to relax the rules for first-time home buyers, in particularly the stress test, which I feel is higher than it needs to be.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, and you can continue that on. You and Mr. Sloan, I'm going to pair you two off right now. So please continue your discussion on affordable housing.
So I'll just jump in there. I don't think there's any way to deal with the housing situation unless we deal with the unrestricted foreign residential real estate purchases. BC, of course, has added a tax. Ontario has done that in certain locations as well. We have to deal with this. I mean, China is what some people call the governing body there, a kleptocracy, where you have people in high positions that are just squirreling away money, and they throw it into countries like Canada and other places, and they'll gladly pay above market rent. They just want to keep their money safe. We have to deal with that, and any plan that doesn't deal with stopping that will never work. And it's clear that that's a major issue that needs to be addressed.
I agree. I would toughen up the rules on foreign buyers and look into penalties for even people who have their properties vacant and who habitually buy properties and keep them vacant for long-term periods, because this affects the pricing, it affects the market, it affects the availability of properties. And so policies that would penalize this type of behavior are essential to making sure that house prices are regulated and are affordable.
Well, you know, stopping vacancy is good, but if 15 houses on the same street are owned by a millionaire high up in the Communist Party of China, and they're renting it out to Canadians who can't even afford to buy a house in their own neighborhood, I think that's a problem. I'm just going to pivot to another issue. Landlord and tenant legislation is provincial, but it's woefully inadequate in many provinces. I speak to many landlords all the time who are small business owners who literally have very little recourse. Their tenants have stopped paying rent through COVID, and they have no recourse. So we need to work with provinces to make sure that we even the playing field there.
All right. On to our second pairing, Mr. Sloan and Mr. O'Toole, affordable housing.
Thank you. I agree with a lot of what Derek's saying about restricting the ability for particularly officials from the Communist Party of China to not only buy up real estate as a safe place for their money, the kleptocracy he talked about, but also it's been documented, the money laundering that's even touched the casinos in British Columbia. We need to make sure that the RCMP and FINTRAC work very closely to root out this. I've also recently said that I'm going to put a ban in place on any former public officials for taking jobs with state-owned enterprises or the Communist Party-led projects once they leave office, because I do think Canadians have to be aware of not just the impact on our housing market, but also the influence that's happening, particularly in parts of the Lower Mainland and in parts of the GTA, by active influence operations from the Communist Party of China.
I'm glad Aaron touched on that because it's such an important issue. We have to, China knows that they can undermine our democracy by essentially paying us off. They know that and they do it. So we need to make sure that we have an anti-infiltration unit that looks at the ways that Communist Party of China agents are actively seeking to cozy up to politicians and others to influence Canada to act in a way that benefits China. So these things are very important. I'm glad that Aaron mentioned that. I, of course, have a plan as well to deal with state-owned enterprises, preventing them from buying our resource projects and other things. But dealing with the real estate issue, I am confident if we put some time into this and some data into this, we're going to see that massive amounts of money from China and from crime are going into real estate. We need to know what's happening and put an end to it.
And I think, as I said, the stress test and some tax changes to provide more supply will also help the acute crisis faced in the Lower Mainland of BC.
Okay, perfect. Mr. O'Toole and Dr. Lewis, you'll have the final 2 minutes on affordable housing, and I'd be curious on hearing a little bit more about this supply ideas.
I agree that we do need to relax the rules, and particularly I found that in practicing real estate law that the stress test really did impact on the ability for especially young people to be able to afford their homes. And I think that we need to have even a specific test that deals with first-time home buyers, which is a much looser test. And while I don't like government intervention with the market, I believe that this action is actually required to make sure that home ownership remains affordable for the average Canadian.
Agreed. And I think going to what you were saying, Jordan, some of the federal tax rules prevent sometimes a carrying over from one property into another. If a landlord is going to invest in another rental property and sells one to get into the other, we need to make sure that they can do that without the gain being taxed if it means more availability, more supply. In my province in Ontario, there's also looking at some of the green space around the GTA. The Ford government's doing that. Those are provincial decisions. But how can we work with the provinces to make supply part of the equation here? Because the demand is there clearly, and there's not enough supply. And that's why the price has been so astronomically high in Vancouver, especially. Take out some of the foreign money, adjust the stress test, and provide more supply, plus a little bit of transit so folks can commute from a little further out into the sort of Fraser Valley type area. That will allow more options for the acute challenges in the Lower Mainland.
Excellent. All right, we'll stop you there. We're going to move on to money laundering, and we can talk a little bit more about some of the issues that we discussed in the previous question. This question comes from Vancouver Centre. Organized crime is a serious problem. A few years ago, Quebec had its Charbonneau Provincial Inquiry into construction industry corruption. And today, British Columbia has the Cullen Commission inquiring into money laundering in casinos, real estate, luxury goods, and beyond. This dirty money is reportedly inflating home prices, fueling both drug and human trafficking, as well as counterfeit goods. Given that the CRA, the Bank Act, FinTrack, CBSA, RCMP, and coordination with Interpol and other state agencies all lie in federal hands, what concrete steps will you take to curb both corruption and money laundering? And would you nationalize provincial efforts into a federal royal commission? We'll start with you, Mr. O'Toole, and then followed by Dr. Lewis and Mr. Sloan.
I think here, less than a royal commission, which is more study, we know some of the problem now. And in fact, Parliament has looked at the money laundering and the terrorist financing aspect, both from a CBSA, RCMP, and FinTrack standpoint. And BC has been a hub, as I said earlier, with the casinos and with the housing market. We also find particularly the money laundering from Communist Party officials is also influencing a wider crisis, including the opioid crisis in BC. So there's been an influx of some of these bad actors and money laundering from parts of Asia. And we have to work with the BC authorities and with law enforcement to root it out and call it out.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis, money laundering.
Well, I think that it's important that we make sure that our law enforcement agencies have sufficient resources and that they're equipped to identify and combat these issues. And I want our law enforcement officers and officials to have the tools that they need to fight modern crime, including white-collared crime. And I don't agree with calls to defund the police. I feel that the RCMP needs more resources in order to address organized crime, intellectual property theft, and foreign interference with our government. And so I would invest in additional resources into these areas.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Mr. Sloan.
Well, I think I agree with Aaron in the sense that a royal commission just means more talk and not getting anything done. So we need to do what we already know. We know that it's a problem, so we need to take federal action. I have said that we need a moratorium on foreign real estate purchases as that involves laundering. We also need to increase funding for CBSA, that's the Border Services, to stop the drug, gun, human trafficking, all that stuff. We need to focus on infiltration from communist China and other criminal elements that are bringing in money from outside of Canada and laundering it here, and of course using drug profits to fuel the rise in housing prices. So that's something we need to take very seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. We're going to pair off Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Sloan for 2 minutes on this topic.
And I'll start off here by saying another issue that we have. The CRA needs to shift its focus from auditing small businesses who are easy targets and start going after real criminals. There are so many small businesses that are getting audited over and over again because the CRA under orders from the Trudeau government feels they need to raise money, and they know that small businesses are sitting ducks. So they need to start auditing the real criminals. And as we do that, we can start to uncover money laundering, and we can start to deal with it.
I agree with Derek in terms of the relentless focus CRA seems to have on SMEs, small business owners, and a lack of focus on overseas tax evasion schemes. On the organized crime issue and the money laundering in BC, I think the Cullen Commission is already looking at some safeguards where we need to track this. When I was a lawyer in the private sector for Procter & Gamble, I ran part of a national, then an international examination of counterfeiting, where organized crime was funneling into counterfeit, relying on the brands of other companies, the intellectual property, to fuel new profits. And I think there's a number of ways we can root out these additional forms of money laundering and organized crime. Certainly, I think additional RCMP resources, particularly as we saw in Surrey over the last number of years, as there was increased gang violence as a part of it. People in the Lower Mainland need to know that they have safe communities. And I think part of that is dealing with the laundering, but part of it is also boots on the ground, community policing, keeping communities safe. And that's going to be our commitment. Our worry is, of course, the Trudeau government has MPs in it that want to legalize all drugs, not just marijuana. So we have to hold the line as Conservatives.
Okay. Mr. O'Toole and Dr. Lewis, 2 minutes on money laundering and other corruption.
Well, white-collar crime is something that is damaging our economy, and I want to make sure that the CBSA, FinTrack, and the RCMP and other agencies have the proper funding that they need to truly fight this crime. And I think that we need to make sure that our Border Patrol agents also have the resources to deal with issues such as human trafficking and drug smuggling.
I agree. In fact, if you look, the Harper government, we provided sidearms to the CBSA and started taking border security seriously from organized crime. The Trudeau government's done the opposite. The Welcome to Canada tweet, we've now seen 60,000 people illegally cross our border to enter Canada, mainly in Quebec, but some in Manitoba. That has also led to a rise in smuggling of all things, drugs, contraband, and illegal guns. So the Trudeau government's making that illegal gun smuggling issue worse. And now they're going after law-abiding firearms owners, as they always do. So I think as Conservatives, we have to show we're going to tackle the real problem, whether it's money laundering, organized crime, the porous border that Trudeau has allowed to happen. We need to fix that, focus on the criminals, and make sure that we reverse the unfair measures advanced by Trudeau in the Order of Council and in Bill C-71.
Agreed. Border Patrol agents need to have sufficient funding, especially to deal with the illicit firearms that are coming in our country. That is the real problem. The law-abiding firearms owners are not the problem. The problem is dealing with the illicit guns that are coming across our borders and the lack of resources that our Border Patrol agents have.
Thank you. I believe we're coming up on 7 o'clock, so you may hear the cannon go off in the background here from Stanley Park as we salute our healthcare workers at 7 o'clock. Final pairing on money laundering, Dr. Lewis and Mr. Sloan.
Well, I think that the Trudeau Liberals have certainly gone after law-abiding gun owners, which won't do a lick of good to actually solve crime. They think it will help them win elections in the Greater Toronto Area and other cities. Of course, that won't work. I have proposed bringing back Harper's mandatory minimums for gang and gun crime. I have proposed putting more money into CBSA services to actually stop some of the smuggling that occurs at the border. Money laundering is a scourge, not just in BC, but other areas. I read an article that estimates that about $10 billion of laundered money has gone into Toronto real estate as well. It's a major problem. We have to start getting away from the naivety of the Trudeau government, who believes that smiles and hugs will solve all world problems. We need to be awake to the risks that we're facing and stop just selling Canada out to the highest bidder. And I think it's very important that we look at ways to stop the destruction of our standard of living, which is occurring at every level.
And I also believe that we should be able to freeze assets, especially of foreigners that are conducting illegal activity in our country. We should be able to freeze those assets of foreign officials and agents that are involved in white-collar crime. And our system should not be overly difficult in doing that.
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And we also need to look at ways of targeting terrorist money that's flowing to and fro. And if any person on Canadian soil is in any way implicated in funding terrorism in any country in the world, their assets need to be seized as well.
Agreed.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to move to question 7. And this comes from Steveston, Richmond East. Hate crimes and racial abuse towards Canadians of East Asian ancestry have spiked 500% in the Lower Mainland compared to this time last year. Given today's highly charged political climate, how will you balance effective criticism of the People's Republic of China on the world stage while maintaining strong and positive outreach to the East Asian Canadian community? Dr. Lewis, we're going to start with you, followed by Mr. Sloan and Mr. O'Toole. Dr. Lewis.
Well, I think it's important that we as Canadians do not tolerate any form of hatred whatsoever, especially hate crimes. And I think it's important that we as politicians be responsible with our words. And it's important that we separate the Communist Party of China from its people. We must not associate Canadians of Chinese descent with the Communist Party of China, because that could fuel hatred against innocent people. We need to stand up as an example of a democracy, and we must call China out when it engages in repressive tactics to its citizens. I believe in fostering a relationship of mutual respect with our trade partners, but I believe that we also have to be firm in standing up for Canadians' rights.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Mr. Sloan.
Well, you know, Justin Trudeau hasn't criticized Communist China for barely anything, and it's causing frustration amongst certain people. And it boils over into abuse towards Chinese Canadians. I believe that by criticizing Communist China, we can show Canadians who the real culprits are with the spread of COVID-19 and can take the focus off of Chinese Canadians here who had nothing to do with it. Chinese Canadians are among some of my most ardent supporters. I have a campaign website in Mandarin for the leadership campaign. They know what Communist China is about. New Canadians from China were sounding the alarm as early as last November about the Wuhan outbreak, and no one was paying attention. Other East Asian Canadians were among the first people to go online and defend me when I called out Dr. Tam for letting the CCP
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sloan. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you. It's not about the country. It's not about the people. We hate the ideology. It's communism. Over the century, last century plus, hundreds of millions of people literally have been oppressed by that dictatorial ideology. And we have to be very careful. And I think conservatives are very careful to make sure that our criticisms of the Chinese state, Beijing, or the Communist Party officials who are ingratiating themselves while they're subjugating the Uyghurs, religious minorities, while they're not living up to the one country, two systems agreement. They're building artificial islands in the South China Sea. They're encroaching and have Arctic ambitions. I've been calling out the Communist Party of China for many years.
Thank you very much. To start, we're going to pair off Dr. Lewis and Mr. O'Toole, 2 minutes on dealing with the China issue and also racism here in British Columbia.
I think it is important. I've talked to colleagues like Nellie Shin and Kenny Chu about concerns within the Chinese Canadian community post-COVID and throughout the pandemic. And I think it's important for all of us to make sure that our concerns with Beijing don't get translated into people spreading division within our own country. I think as public officials, that's important. I do think we also have a key role to make sure that the closeness the Trudeau government tried to build with the Communist Party of China is pulled back from in a dramatic way.
Well, and I think it's very important that we recalibrate our entire relations with China, not just how we deal with them as democratic, in a democratic sense, but also our trade relations. And I think it's important that we demand fair play from China and we stand up for ourselves. And that is the only way that we're going to gain respect in the international community. And I think that we have to set an example for democracy. And we do have to call China out when we see that they are acting in ways that are very repressive to their citizens.
And 2 years ago, I asked Justin Trudeau in the House of Commons about the Communist Party's manipulation of the World Health Organization. They were excluding Taiwan from pandemic planning, a country that had worked with Canada on the response to the SARS crisis. So we have to call out that the Communist Party has manipulated UN agencies. And as a result, the response to COVID-19 has been slow. The Chinese regime covered it up. And it's up to Canada to work with our allies, including the US, the UK, Australia, and others, to make sure we hold these institutions to account and that we start looking at China the way it acts, not the way Justin Trudeau thinks it is.
Yes, and I think
all right. Actually, Dr. Lewis, I'm going to reset the clock to 2 minutes and put you and Mr. Sloan in, but go ahead, 2 minutes.
Well, I think here again we need to look at the fact that Chinese agents of espionage are operating on our very soil, and we hear reports of Chinese Canadians who are protesting against Hong Kong and protesting against communist China advances, and they're threatened on our very soil here. So I want to make it very clear that we will put together an anti-infiltration task force that actually investigates the CSIS reports that are telling us that this is happening and does something about it, that arrests these people and gets them out of Canada. Again, we know that China is controlling, for example, organizations like the World Health Organization. We have to stop funding these organizations. We need to reduce Chinese influence, be aware of the fact that they're trying to buy off business leaders and even politicians in our very own country, and stand up against it. That is my commitment to you.
I think the U.S. has set a good example in freezing the assets of top Chinese Communist Party officials and their relatives. And I think that Canada should follow that example if it will foster a more respectful relationship, a relationship of mutual respect between the countries. And one example is that we should be requesting the release of Michael Korvig and Michael Stavor, or at least allowing them to have bail. We've treated Meng with great dignity. She was allowed to live in her multi-million-dollar mansion in Vancouver, while the two Michaels are living in a dilapidated cell. And so we should call for that mutual respect between the countries.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't think it will happen. We need to start arresting some of these agents and start playing hardball when it comes to getting the two Michaels back.
All right. And finally on this question, Mr. Sloan and Mr. O'Toole.
You know, I'll just start again here by saying that when it comes to dealing with Chinese influence here in Canada, we have to stop these front groups that are recruiting students on campus. We have to stop the threats that they're giving towards students on campus. We need to make sure that we block Huawei from building our 5G network. And we also have to make sure that we send a clear signal that we support democratic nations like Taiwan, and that we will be divesting our trade relationships and making new friends in Southeast Asia.
Well, Derek, as you probably know, I've been pushing on a lot of those things over the last number of years. And the first defeat Justin Trudeau had in the House of Commons, you remember, probably one of your first votes, was when we beat Trudeau and established a new parliamentary oversight committee for Canada-China relations. That was my bill. And so we need to fight Trudeau again and reverse the decline we've had and stand up for the two Michaels. I've been doing that and suggested, Dr. Lewis referred to sanctions the US have brought in. I've suggested bringing Magnitsky sanctions if the two Michaels aren't released within 60 days of a Conservative government. I will make that happen and then ask other allies to apply similar sanctions, to apply pressure. I agree with Derek. We have to be resolute. We have to be firm. China sees and preys on weakness, and Justin Trudeau has been weak.
Yeah, you know, and I think we have to go further than that. For example, we're partnering with a Chinese firm to develop a COVID vaccine, a firm that's affiliated with the Chinese military. I don't know how that could ever foster trust in the Canadian public for such a vaccine. I also believe we have to be careful with state-owned enterprises that are purchasing resource projects here in Canada, and I would ban that for Chinese SOEs.
Me as well.
Thank you both. Our next question comes from Vancouver Centre. We have heard from many members, especially our young Conservatives, that it has never felt so difficult to be publicly conservative as it does today. Many young Conservatives are compelled to be silent about their principles due to fear of deplatforming, censorship, and even their personal safety. This emerging issue is prevalent across the country, especially on Canadian university campuses, and it is furthermore prevalent here in British Columbia. One of our volunteers, Tristan, had his employer contacted because he liked a post on Facebook that was conservative. And another volunteer, Angelo, has been anonymously labeled as a fascist for merely hosting conservative speakers at a club event like Jordan Peterson. What will you specifically do to protect and uphold freedom of expression and turn the tide against cancel culture? We're going to start with you, Mr. Sloan, followed by Mr. O'Toole and Dr. Lewis. Mr. Sloan.
Well, I'm glad to be able to answer this. And I too was involved with the group that brought Jordan Peterson to Queen's Law School when I was a student there. This is near and dear to my heart. And if I can't do anything else as leader of this country, I will restore free speech again. I will eliminate cancel culture in our own party with open and free nominations. I will even go so far as to make a law that criminalizes cheating in political processes. And I'm not so much talking about conservatives, although we could improve. That happens all the time in the other parties, and we need to be able to bring that to light. I also will pull funding from universities that don't uphold free speech. And I have a great law that will prevent banning on social media for personal, political, and moral opinions. This is a great topic, and I'll talk about it more in the open debate.
All right, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you. I've spoken to the Free Speech Club at UBC, who told me firsthand several years ago about the chill about any opinion other than the left on campus. Even a few weeks ago in BC, a member of the Board of Governors liked to tweet, and there was the mob on him as well. When I launched my campaign, I talked about cancel culture, not just in the last couple of months, because 3 years ago, I started challenging Trudeau on removing names from buildings. I debated union leaders and university professors on campus and lived. I defended Sir John A. Macdonald statues. We have to stand up for our history, and we have to promote free speech and the ability to have debate in a modern democracy.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Dr. Lewis.
Yes, so I think that canceled culture is ruining our understanding of the past. And until someone is willing to stand up to it, it is going to wash away our history in a wave of progressive revisionism. And so we can learn a lot about our past, but if we erase it, then we might be doomed to repeat it. And I think that people are imperfect, and we should accept that good human beings also have fault. And we can learn from those past mistakes. I plan on fighting back this wave of political correctness that has people walking around on eggshells in this country. And I too will withhold federal funding from universities and colleges who do not respect freedom of expression and who do not respect freedom of speech on campus.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lewis and Mr. Sloan, 2 minutes on freedom of expression, cancel culture, free speech.
Well,
I would also repeal Bill C-48, Bill C-8 and Bill C-16, because I believe that these legislations have actually overstepped parental rights with respect to even limiting a parent's right to speak to their children about certain topics. And it is in pursuit of political correctness. So I think it's very important that we look at these legislations that have encroached upon our fundamental freedoms and that we put a stop to them.
Well, I'm just going to go back, and I agree with what you're saying on that, Leslyn. When it comes to universities that don't support free speech, they don't deserve to be funded from the federal purse. And those that hire teachers that are promoting cancel culture. I just want to talk a little bit about my social media platform. Social media platforms are integral to how we exchange information. And we know that their algorithms are biased. We know that they're silencing people. We saw an interview on Rebel News for someone who was hired in the last election to scrub posts from Facebook that spoke negatively about Jagmeet Singh or spoke about open borders and things like that. This is an affront to our democracy. I will prevent that from happening if I'm elected. I, of course, have also been the most vocal person against Bill C-16, which does impede our free speech rights, and Bill C-8, which basically would criminalize parents for trying to help their kids. So I do agree with you on that. And these issues are how we can win and gain ground in this next election.
All right, let's go now to Mr. Sloan and Mr. O'Toole, 2 minutes on that same topic.
Thank you. As I was saying earlier, when Trudeau removed the name of a father of Confederation off the Prime Minister's building in Ottawa, I was the only voice that took him on. And I took him on with knowledge to say, you know who opened more residential schools than Hector Langevin? Your father, Justin. Pierre Trudeau opened 6, 100 years later. So let's have serious debates. I've gone on campus to do that. I've defended free speech for many years, and that's what we have to do as conservatives. I also appeared on BC media after the first statue to come down was sadly in Victoria because of an social activist counselor on Victoria Council who seems destined to try and rewrite the history to suit his left-wing political narrative. I think it's important for conservatives to stand up on principle against that.
Well, I'm against cancel culture in its entirety, and I appreciate what Aaron O'Toole said about Sir John A. Macdonald. I also live in the Bay of Quinte, where Sir John A. Was born, and he wasn't born there, but that's where he practiced law and became involved in politics. So it's very near and dear to my heart. And his grave, of course, is a little under an hour from my home in Kingston, Ontario. So I think it's very important that we stand up and say, listen, our founding fathers and people in the past, they weren't perfect, but they have a story to tell. They made decisions according to values that were common at that time. And there's many things that we can learn. And the left's decision to try and whitewash all of this stuff and just, to roll this under so that they can start their own new society according to their own dictates is wrong. And we must stand up against it at all costs.
And if you look, they always go after the conservative icons. So it's Langevin, it's Macdonald, it's never Laurier who held the same views, or Trudeau. I don't see the move to take his name off the Montreal airport. It's always the left fighting against our icons.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Sorry, that's 2 minutes. Mr. O'Toole, you didn't mention Tommy Douglas there, but maybe you will in this next 2 minutes where you and Dr. Lewis finish this conversation.
Well, we have to.
Sorry, Mr. O'Toole and Dr. Lewis, sorry.
Well, certainly Tommy Douglas, who I think CBC rated the top Canadian years ago, is known for supporting eugenics and other very, very troubling things in the past. What we have to do, and I think my colleagues both alluded to this, is look at the history and context and look at the fact that all politicians are human. You know, they all are a product of their environment and their society and the times, and we can't use the morality of today to judge the past. We can learn from it. In fact, if we try and scrub it clean, as the left would do to suit their narrative, we risk not learning from it and not teaching future generations. That's why when Trudeau first did it as the Prime Minister of Canada on National Indigenous Day, I said at the time it was a slippery slope, and now we see the cancel culture we're in.
I think it's important that we learn lessons from our past. And I think that one lesson that we are learning from this whole cancel culture initiative that's underway is that there's nothing wrong with telling both sides of the history. And we can see that there are good people who have done not perfect things. And history is about telling the stories of the victors. And sometimes it's important to tell the stories of the conquered and the oppressed peoples also. And so I think that it's important that when we see a statue of one of our founding fathers that may have advocated for residential schools, I think that it's important that we look at that and we say, well, what are the stories of the people that were in residential schools? But I don't think that it's the right approach to erase one side of our history because we've had imperfect leaders.
Yeah, I agree. And what's interesting is when you actually engage the left on a fight, who ended residential schools? Mulroney. Who created the reconciliation apology? Harper. Our record in modern times is actually better than the Liberals.
Thank you very much. We're going to move now to the second phase, but before we do, I just want to say thank you to all three of you. You've been excellent in respecting the timelines, and in fact, we're running ever so slightly ahead of schedule. And given the news today, the fiscal update, and I use that term loosely, that we've now are headed towards $1 trillion debt, $343 billion in deficit. I thought I might give you each 60 seconds just to talk about, like, how are we going to get out of this hole that Justin Trudeau has dug for us? I know this, you weren't prepped for this beforehand, but I'm sure you've been thinking about it all day long. How do we get out of this this fiscal mess that Justin Trudeau has left for us? And I'll start with you, Mr. O'Toole.
Well, first of all, we have to gain the trust of Canadians, starting in September in the House, take the fight to Trudeau, ask for disclosure, get a plan to get the fiscal house back in order. And what we really need is a relaunch of our economy, saving small businesses, and then launch the sectors we talked about tonight: energy, forestry, mining, minerals, manufacturing. We need to fight for better deals for our aluminum sector, the refinery and smelter in Kitimat, the steel mill in Sault Ste. Marie or Hamilton. They've all been getting bad outcomes from Justin Trudeau, including no softwood lumber agreement, as we talked about earlier. We need everyone to have a job if they can have one, to provide for their family. If we get back to full employment and tackle the overspending of the Liberals, then we can get back on a path to prosperity. It's $343 billion deficit. Can you imagine the taxes the Liberals are going to raise? They were raising taxes across the board when they were running a $20 billion deficit. So as leader, I will take this fight to them and we will get the economy back under control.
Thank you. And Mr. O'Toole, we've lost your video feed, but I can still hear you. So I believe we were still broadcasting your response. Mr. Sloan, 60 seconds. How are we going to dig out of this for our kids and grandkids?
Well, you know, we're going to get out of it the same way you do when you're in any hole, and that's stop digging. There's no magical way to get out of this. We have to unleash our economy. A large part of that's getting our energy sector back on track. So repealing Bill C-48, repealing Bill C-69. Again, I am dead set against the Paris Accord. The Paris Agreement. In French, it's Accord. We have to get out of that. It is going to sewer our energy development. There is no way we can be in that and have any hope of getting our energy sector back on track. We also have to cut taxes and regulations to spur entrepreneurship and growth. I have a very detailed small business plan that talks about all kinds of tax incentives for small businesses. I'm a former small business owner. I started, operated, and ran my own business for several years. I know what it's like. I know what the red tape issues that we have. This is what we have to do. We have to look at unique funding options, crowdfunding, promoting our own capital markets here in Canada. I have a great plan for that.
Thank you very much. And finally to you, Dr. Lewis, $1 trillion debt. It's hard to believe.
Thank you. So I think a part of the problem why we're in this situation is because we didn't have a costed impact assessment for COVID. And although we were in a crisis situation, it is something that our finance department is supposed to do. So we would have had a more long-term plan. What we do need now is we need a long-term plan to phase out our deficit and to get us out of this hole. And the only way that we could do that is by upping production and unleashing policies that will encourage investment and get people back to work. I think we need to kickstart our economy by stimulating small and medium-sized businesses, which employ over 80% of all Canadians. And that means that we have to cut the red tape and make it easier for businesses to function and to take chances on people again. I think that we also have to adopt the Canada First strategy in manufacturing our own supplies and our own medical supplies, such as gloves and respirators and masks, and providing incentives for corporations to transition to that.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. And thank you all three of you for indulging me, indulging this old fiscal conservative in that question. It's going to keep a lot of people up at night thinking about how to do this. For this second period, every candidate will get the opportunity to ask another candidate a question of their choosing, followed by a brief discussion. The question is limited to 30 seconds, the answer to 60 seconds, and then a 90-second debate following that. So the first person to ask a question is Dr. Lewis, and she's going to ask Mr. Sloan a 30-second question. Dr. Lewis.
Well, Mr. Sloan, leadership races can be very divisive, and I'm just wondering about what is your plan to unite caucus after this leadership race?
Good question, thank you. Well, you know, I believe that the results of our leadership voting, being as they are a ranked ballot system where, you know, over half of the party has to agree on a particular candidate through several levels of voting. I believe that that will result in a leader that is broadly accepted and respected by the membership. I believe, of course, in the Conservative Party that I know as a caucus member is one that always plays well as a team, and they will rally around the leader that is chosen by the membership. So I'm confident that will be the case, and I'm looking forward to see the results.
Thank you. And then two of you have 90 seconds to debate this.
Well, Mr. Sloan, it's, you know, I think it's a very unfortunate situation that there are a number of caucus members that were attempting to push you out. And so I see that it might be a very difficult issue for you to be able to unite caucus members that were initially trying to exclude you from being a part of the caucus. And so I'm very curious about how you're going to just deal with that issue.
Well, that was, of course, based off of comments I made on Dr. Tam. I said that she should be fired. Of course, it had nothing to do with her background. It had to do with her performance as our Chief Public Health Officer. I continue to stand by those comments, and I'll say it again, Dr. Tam should be fired. Since that time, my comments have been vindicated through many sources. And I will say, actually, Aaron O'Toole didn't ask me to say this, but I will say that he defended me repeatedly on that front, and I want to thank him for that. But you know what? The temperatures flare high sometimes, and we don't know the motivations for certain things. It could have been other leadership candidates, maybe who aren't here tonight, that were trying to orchestrate certain things. I can't say for sure, but I'm confident that whoever wins this leadership race will be able to unite the party. Whoever is the strongest on the issues, whoever has the vision for the country will win this leadership race. The members will speak, and caucus will respect their decision.
Thank you both. Just whatever you do on behalf of millions of British Columbians. Please do not take Dr. Bonnie away from us here in British Columbia. Mr. Sloan, do you have a question for Mr. O'Toole?
I do.
Go ahead, 30 seconds.
Okay, so the Liberals brag that their conversion therapy bill C8 is the most progressive law in the world on that subject. This is the law that could jail parents for up to 5 years for trying to affirm their child's birth gender. And I would like to ask Aaron if he could articulate a denunciation of this self-proclaimed most progressive law. If this is the most progressive law, surely conservatives can find a way to critique it.
Mr. O'Toole, 60 seconds.
Thanks. I have been talking to a number of people about their concerns over C8, and I think it's important for a leader to be straight. I oppose conversion therapy. I think in many cases it's attempts to push medical treatment on someone without their consent. And so I've said I have concerns with it right from the start. That said, C8 has some definitions in it that are extremely broad, and people have raised valid concerns of the potential encroachment on religious freedom, on the ability for a parent to discuss things with one of their children as they're growing. And I think this is where Parliament is meant to work. We talked about cancel culture. Parliament means to speak, parlement. It means we should hear concerns from people because religious freedom and standing up for that is important. So I've heard these concerns. As many social conservatives know, I will fight hard to make sure they're an important part of our party.
Thank you very much. And now, gentlemen, you have 90 seconds to debate this topic.
Well, you know, for me, and I see the way that the numbers of kids who are identifying with gender dysphoria are exploding. And one thing that many people don't realize is that kids in the foster system experience gender dysphoria and are diagnosed with it at a much higher rate than the average population. And they're oftentimes put on drugs and pushed towards gender reassignment surgery or sex change operations. I don't think this is the type of thing we should be pushing on kids. The Bill C8 is what is called an affirmation only model of care, which means if your kid starts talking about it, you just push them down and push them in that direction. We know that most kids will ultimately grow out of gender dysphoria by the time they reach puberty. It's not right that we allow these type of operations on kids. I have said we will ban these sex change operations for kids under 18. They've done it in the UK. They're not a bunch of religious radicals over there. They've looked at the evidence and they've made the right decision.
25 seconds to you, Mr. O'Toole.
Certainly pushing things on anyone I disagree with as a conservative, whether an adult or a child. And that's where I have some concerns about the therapy being pushed on people without their consent. But I know that many people share that same concern about it impacting a pastor talking to people in their congregation, parents talking to kids at puberty. So I think it's important that we debate these issues, and there are valid concerns about the overbreadth of some definitions in C8.
Thank you both. For our next question, Mr. O'Toole, a question for Dr. Lewis, 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. And my question will be very similar to Dr. Lewis's. This leadership is in many ways like a dress rehearsal for the coming election, which could be in the next few months, could be within the next year. We've got to prepare quickly, return to Parliament, win the debates after the pandemic, have leadership debates in English and French. We have to fight back against the media and the liberal war room. What steps will you take to make sure our party's ready to win?
60 seconds to you. Sorry.
Well, I think it's important, first of all, I know that you've alluded to the fact that we have to communicate in both English and French, so I would like to address that. I think it's important for a leader to be able to speak in both official languages, and I am working very hard on my French every day. I'm not a career politician that has had access to free French lessons, and so I'm working on improving my French, and I respected the French speakers of this country enough to do a very scary thing, which was debate in their language only after having, cumulatively about 23 hours of French lessons. And so I responded to that by rising to the challenge. And I think that it's, I'm enjoying learning the French language, and it's a beautiful language. And I think that the people of Quebec have been very receptive to the fact that I'm showing such initiative in learning the language. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I will face with respect to.
I'm going to cut you off there, but I'm going to put you and Mr. O'Toole into a 90-second debate. Go ahead.
I'll let you finish because he cut you off. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So I know another issue is the fact that I don't have a seat, Mr. O'Toole, and with respect to that, there's rumors that there could be an early election, and in that capacity, there will be nobody with a seat at that time. So we will all be in the same position. So I don't see that as a deterrent. And there have been precedents for this in the past. There have been other leaders who have not have seats, such as Brian Mulroney, and he won the leadership and went on to be a successful prime minister.
I certainly hope you get a seat, and I think that would make our caucus even stronger. And I think on a lot of issues, even the three of us here tonight, 3 out of the 4 running have given the courtesy to folks in BC to show up. On many issues we agree, and I think you would be an excellent voice in our caucus. I think the challenge we will have is we will have a few months to hold Trudeau to account for a $1.2 trillion debt, the ability that he's going to have to raise taxes, the fact that they've been trying to squelch dissent on a whole range of issues. I think we have to be able to fight him right out of the gate in the benches. And I do think that that's a bit of a challenge. I know you were considering running in the last election.
Actually, I wasn't considered, well, I couldn't run in the last election because I was completing my doctorate. And so that limited that opportunity. And unfortunately, right now, the Prime Minister has shown a real disrespect from our Parliament anyways, Mr. O'Toole. So having a sitting seat in the House of Parliament right now would not even guarantee accountability because of the way the Prime Minister is conducting business.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Again, I'm a very polite human in real life. But Dr. Lewis, I'm going to allow you now to turn the tables on Mr. O'Toole and ask him a question for 30 seconds.
Mr. O'Toole, you had indicated that you would like to reopen negotiations for free trade between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And my concern is that by reopening those negotiations, that would put the Canadian dairy market in peril. So my question to you is, why wouldn't you prioritize that trade and deal with Latin America rather than opening up potential of Canadian dairy farmers and agricultural businesses to competition with the Australia, New Zealand, and UK market?
And 60 seconds to you, Mr. O'Toole.
Well, first, the CANZUC, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, they are our closest allies. They're 4 of the 5 Eyes allies. They're Commonwealth partners. We share the same sovereign, the rule of law. We already have exchanges. We fought and died together. So I think our best friends we need to do more with on the world stage, both in terms of trade, the opportunity for student and work exchanges, the ability for us to do more on a defense and cybersecurity, fighting against Huawei together. Trudeau's the only 5 Eyes out of step with our allies. And look, we already have the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The issue with respect to milk has been solved with Australia and New Zealand in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that's an issue that's being put out there really to stop us from doing, I think, the most important trade agreement we could have in the modern era. Boris Johnson, post-Brexit, is talking to Australia and New Zealand right now. Trudeau's not at the table. I will be.
Okay, and then 90 seconds for Dr. Lewis and Mr. O'Toole to debate this topic. Go ahead.
But in actuality, the only issue that has not been solved is the Canadian dairy market issue. And when you open up the trade to that, you are putting the dairy market in a really perilous situation. And there are a number of dairy farmers that are very, very concerned that your proposal will put their market in jeopardy.
That won't happen because the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that I was involved in negotiating as parliamentary secretary in the Harper government addressed those commodities. And in fact, we can't allow an issue that's already been resolved to hold us up from a partnership with our closest allies. And so I worked on trade. In fact, we negotiated the European and other trade agreements while respecting the supply managed sectors, but getting new market access for our non-supply managed sectors. I know this was a top issue in the last leadership race. It really isn't in this one, because I think all farmers know we need to open up more market access for beef, pork, grain, oilseeds. We're going to need new markets for canola that China is blocking. So we need free trade, but amongst free nations, rule of law, democracy nations, not bad actors like China. That's why Australia, New Zealand, UK, we should be doing more with them. We can do more with other countries too, but our best friends should come first.
But isn't there more of an untapped potential?
Sorry, we're at time, so I'm going to stop you there. Mr. Sloan, do you have a question for Dr. Lewis? A 30-second question, please. Go ahead.
I do. So in December 2011, the Harper government pulled back its commitment to the Kyoto Agreement because it would have had disastrous consequences for our economy. Right now, we're in a similar agreement called the Paris Agreement, which is also having disastrous consequences on our economy. You have said that you don't mind the Paris Agreement because it's not binding, but why bother staying in an agreement that you're not going to honor anyways? And whether we meet the goals or not, the goal of this is to be carbon zero, which would destroy our energy industry. Please explain why you support this agreement. 60
seconds to you, Dr. Lewis.
Actually, the Kyoto Agreement and the Paris Agreement are actually two very distinctive and different agreements, Mr. Sloan. The Kyoto Agreement dealt with specific mechanisms and specific technologies that had to be implemented. And so that was very, very different. Whereas the Paris Agreement deals with independent individual contributions that the countries voluntarily make. And so one is a voluntary agreement and the other one is not. And so there's a clear distinction. And we have to, the problem with that I have with the Paris Agreement is that we did not do a costed impact assessment of that. And so we have had bad policies such as Bill C-48 and Bill C-69. Those policies were self-inflicted by our national regulators. They had nothing to do with policies that were imposed by the Paris Accord. And so we have to understand the distinction between, first of all, Kyoto and Paris Accord, and also our ability to maintain our national sovereignty within the Paris Accord. That does not affect our ability to develop our natural resources.
That's time, but I'm going to put you and Mr. Sloan into a 90-second debate on the topic. Go ahead.
So the issue that I see, though, is that our commitment is to reduce our emissions by 30% by 2030. China, on the other hand, is allowed to increase their emissions until 2030. So are you saying that you would change our commitment to lower our emissions by 30%? And if so, what would that commitment be?
Well, actually, what I would do is I would invest in our industries, such as like our liquefied natural gas, and I would export it to countries such as China, and that would embolden our economy, and that would also help countries like China reduce their emissions targets. And so, when we look at the environment, we look at it from a global perspective, and so there are things that we can do as Canadians to assist other countries. And so developing our natural resources is not something that we have to do that's mutually exclusive from the environment. We can do that while investing in environmental stewardship.
Excuse me, sorry, Dr. Liz, I just want to say one thing here. So the issue, I totally agree with you that we need to export our liquid natural gas, but it is a myth that exporting liquid natural gas will actually impact our Paris commitments. It will help China, but it doesn't help us. We're selling it to them and they're using it. And it's the idea that we can export our natural gas and meet Paris is an absolute myth.
And then that's time on this topic. Thank you both. For our final question in this round, Mr. O'Toole, you have 30 seconds to ask a question of Mr. Sloan.
Thank you. Mr. Sloan, as you know, for many years, I've been quite critical of the UN and particularly the Trudeau obsession for his Security Council bid that had him cozying up to dictators, letting down our allies, and still losing. A typical liberal trifecta there: losing, letting our allies down, and adding to the corruption of the regime. I've talked about holding back UN dues and UN reform. What are you saying that's different than what I've been proposing for several years?
And 60 seconds to you, Mr. Sloan.
Well, I agree with you on that. I have gone so far as to say that other organizations which are in the UN sphere, like the World Health Organization, should be defunded until it is clear that they are not politically implicated to countries like China. I also believe that we need to pull out or take our signature away from things like the UN Mass Migration Compact. We certainly should not be legislating the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into law. I agree with you that we need to hold a healthy skepticism for the UN and what they're doing. You made a comment earlier about it being filled with bad actors who want to impose rules on others, but they don't want to stand up to it themselves. So I think we do need to be very skeptical on these particular issues. And yes, we need to reduce funding. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in our 90 seconds.
Perfect. And let's set the 90-second clock now. And Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Sloan, go ahead.
So I met with some charities who typically receive government funding, and they actually, believe it or not, in the in the money gone wild era of Justin Trudeau, they said that their government funding was actually way down. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, actually, Justin Trudeau has taken a lot of money that typically would go to Canadian charities, and he's giving it to the UN. And we have seen time and time again, taking that money and using it to try and buy access and get certain appointments there. And of course, they failed. But it is absolutely disgusting that we're doing that. And thank you for bringing that up and asking me.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. They would take funds away from real development aid, often run by faith organizations or related service club organizations, and give it to certain UN things as part of his bid to get the seat. Specifically, I talked about holding back funding from UNRWA and from other agencies. I've also said that peacekeeping is profoundly broken. I know many veterans from Rwanda that have operational stress injuries from the fact the UN failed there to protect the soldiers and to prevent a genocide. What do you think about the withholding of dues from agencies to clean up their act?
I think we need to always have that as a tool on our table. And I think that's a great idea. And we can use it, like I said, in universities that are protecting free speech all the way to the UN.
Thank you both. Excellent. All right. The candidates are about to make a final 1-minute statement, a pitch to us, the voters. But before they do, I just want to make sure I thank the candidates for being here tonight. I want to thank the 42 British Columbia Conservative Party of Canada EDAs for coming together and doing this. The volunteers technically who have helped put this together behind the scenes. I can tell you this is very much a grassroots effort, and it's been exciting to be a part of it. And I want to thank them for asking me to moderate, and especially to you, the viewers, those of you who have stuck through and listened to the answers to these questions. I hope it's been as helpful to you as it has been to me. The closing statements, we're going to start with you, Mr. O'Toole. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you to the BC EDAs. We need to pick a leader that will unite this party. Peter MacKay started this race by suggesting social conservatives and some other people that didn't share his view on issues would not be welcome. That's not the sign of a leader. I'm the only candidate in this race that can not only beat Peter MacKay and keep our party united, but can win the next election. So unity, having a true blue leader, and somebody that can win where we really need to win. I've won 3 times in the Greater Toronto area. I will win again in that region, building on much of the success Premier Ford has had in Southern Ontario. And the route to power is also through British Columbia. I've helped dozens of ridings on the island, in the Fraser Valley, the Okanagan, Prince George, in and around Vancouver. It's a very important province. If we get the balance right in BC and in Ontario, we will form the next government. We will get our country back on track. I'm ready to go. I need your support.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Sloan, your 60 seconds.
I'm the strongest candidate when it comes to conservative principles. We need to have commitments to the family, national sovereignty, free speech, and individual liberty. And I'm the only candidate, as I've said, who will pull us out of the Paris Agreement and block all forms of carbon pricing. I am the strongest candidate against cancel culture. I will never block nomination candidates for their beliefs, police people's speech, or make conservative MPs apologize for being conservative. I will defund the World Health Organization. I will scale back funding for the UN. I will reduce immigration to 150,000 people a year and put a moratorium on foreign real estate purchases. I'm the only candidate who will replace the Firearms Act, repeal all liberal gun grabs, and entrench a right of self-defense in Canadian law. I have proven I will never back down to the media. I will not compromise our message. I'm the most electable. And I've said from the beginning, we need strong answers to all issues facing Canadians, not just the economy, but other issues as well, such as housing, poverty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Lewis, 60 seconds to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Today, the Liberals announced that we now have a $343 billion deficit. This is confirmation that Canada is truly at a crossroads. We've witnessed the erosion of our sovereignty, our credit rating, our economy, and our fundamental freedoms. Canada is really being made over into the socialist vision of Justin Trudeau. In order to win the next election, we're going to have to do things differently. I am the leader that can beat Justin Trudeau and fight against the Liberal attacks. I am the leader with a Master's of Environmental Studies who can present a credible environmental plan. I am the leader that can win the large urban settings and bring in new conservatives with diverse backgrounds into our party. I am the leader that can unite this party. We are going to need to be united in order to rebuild our way out of COVID. We can only do this by cutting red tape for businesses, creating infrastructure, getting our products to the market. I'm sorry?
That's 60 seconds. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt again. That's your time. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. To the members watching at home, Conservatives, watch your mailboxes for your ballots this month. Be sure they're back in Ottawa before August 21st. On Wednesday, July 15th, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney will join my organization, ICBA, for a virtual town hall on Canada's energy industry and how it, and British Columbia specifically, can lead us out of the COVID-19 recession. For details and to register for that free Zoom event, you can check out icba.ca/energy. Mr. Derek Sloan, Mr. Aaron O'Toole, Dr. Leslie Lewis, thank you again for joining us. And for all of you watching at home, thank you, and don't forget to vote.
Thank you.